And this is what happens when we lose control over the supply of something as important as medicine. We lose control over quality. We see during coronavirus, we're losing control over price, because in shortages, prices spike. And then we lose control really over our national sovereignty. If you think about it, when we lose control over medicines and somebody else is controlling that supply, whoever controls that supply controls the world. You know, it's not the first time China has threatened us with drug shortages. They've threatened the United States with drug shortages before. But this threat was out there, very visible. The other threat was a very quiet threat. And I learned about it when I was writing China RX. I mean, this is a threat to kill Americans by withholding medicines. You can't get more brazen than that. And if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is.
Just how is it possible that the global supply of ingredients that make up medicines is almost entirely controlled by China? How is this being used as leverage against other countries, especially the US? What would happen if China decided to stop exporting medicine components, especially now during the CCP virus or coronavirus outbreak? Why are special interests like Big Pharma lobbying against a potential Buy American executive order? And could it be possible that medicines manufactured in the US could actually be produced cheaper than using global supply chains, as most are today? In this episode, we sit down with Rosemary Gibson, Senior Advisor at the Hastings Center and author of China RX, exposing the risks of America's dependence on China for medicine. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Rosemary Gibson, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Rosemary, I thought of you immediately because of some recent news. You know, of course, since you wrote the book China RX. Recently, we've seen this CCP virus or coronavirus pandemic expose big issues in supply chains and manufacturing and so forth. A lot of countries have actually been seeing this. And amidst all this, the Chinese Communist Party has threatened to basically stop drug exports or even precursor exports from China to the US. Tell me, what do you think that would do here in America?
As I wrote in China RX, the United States and the rest of the world is dramatically dependent on China for thousands of medicines that are taken every day. These are mostly generic drugs. And if China shut the door on exports of the core chemicals and other ingredients to make them, we'll see countries waiting in line to get vital medicines to care for their populations. We're already beginning to see the rivalry with regard to pricing for, certain drugs that are now becoming more scarce because global demand has increased with coronavirus. It's a very serious situation that we're approaching. We have a perfect storm of production shutdowns have taken place in China because of coronavirus. Workers were not going to work so they could stay home and take care of themselves and their families. Transportation routes have been constrained. Huge demand in China. And then as the coronavirus spread around the world, global demand increased. And meanwhile, the whole supply chain for the world's medicines is concentrated so much in a single country. And now we're beginning to see countries like the United Kingdom, India, and even Hungary, as well as others, that are banning the exports of medicines because they want to make sure that they have enough for their own people. These are unprecedented times that we're in. We're in uncharted waters. And I did predict this, and regrettably it's happening, when I wrote in China RX that in the event of a natural disaster or global pandemic, if China shuts the door, countries will indeed line up to get vital medicines for their people.
So White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro has been talking about this Buy American executive order that's in the works, and there's also been, reports, we've reported on this, of Big Pharma basically lobbying against this. Would love to get your perspective on this.
Yes, my understanding is that the draft executive order being prepared by the White House would have a provision for the Defense Department, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Health and Human Services, that they would buy American-made medicines, all of them, all of their components. And that could revitalize industry here in this country, but also diversify the manufacturing base that would benefit the rest of the world. But we're seeing some headwinds coming up against that draft executive order. And it's really quite surprising that there appears to be opposition to making medicines in America. We're seeing at a time of a global pandemic that countries shut down their supply chains so they keep medicines in their own home country. So this opposition, it's really very curious why any company would want to oppose making medicines here in the United States. We're so dependent that we can't even make antibiotics anymore in the United States. That began in the early 2000s when the United States opened up free trade with China, and the last penicillin plant shut down, the last vitamin C plant shut down. And that happened because China undercut companies on price and kept prices low for a long time. These are illegal trade practices. And that's how we lost our penicillin capability and the production of generic antibiotics, which is really quite remarkable. And the world's dependence is on a single country for so many of the antibiotics that are needed. And so we've got to think about ways that we can bring our manufacturing back home, not all of it, but some of it, to assure our national health security.
Given actually what the CCP virus pandemic, coronavirus pandemic is sort of exposing here, increasingly, I think, is that China is hardly benign under the Chinese Communist Party. And, as you're saying all this, I'm thinking this isn't just a health issue, even though that's the core point, but this is a serious national security issue because of the health issue that it potentially creates. What do you think?
Oh, that's right. And other countries are feeling this in the same situation. Last year, there was a Dutch public television documentary that highlighted the Netherlands' dependence on China for critical medicines, again, because China has the dominant global market share of those core chemicals. Because what are our pharmaceuticals? They're basically chemicals formulated to treat and cure disease. And the Dutch authorities and retired industry people have said that, we're concerned now that China could withhold our medicines, and that was pre-coronavirus. So now here we are in this situation where we have a global pandemic. So it's not just the United States that is concerned about this, but other countries are concerned as well.
Well, I was reading recently that China is promising to ramp up its production, at least of these precursor chemicals.
That's right, and I think the question is that a good thing to continue concentrating the world's global supply of medicine in a single country? The world would not appreciate having 80 or 90% of the world's oil coming from a single country, whatever country that may be. And for the same reason, we shouldn't consider and see it as appropriate to have 80 to 90% of the core components to make critical drugs coming from a single country. We have to diversify the manufacturing base. And there are small companies in the United States that want to do that, to fill that vacuum and to meet that need. And I hope there's opportunity to do that not only here, but around the world. Let's take a look at the medicines that are needed to treat people who are hospitalized with coronavirus. These patients will need sedatives if they're placed on a ventilator. They will need antibiotics if they get a secondary infection that's bacterial in nature. They will need medicines if their blood pressure falls precipitously to bring it back up, to revive them. And 90% of the core chemicals to make those medicines are sourced in China. So the whole world is, all those roads lead to China in terms of global supply, and that can actually be dangerous for global public health. It was actually quite remarkable to me that in writing China RX, it took 3 years to do the research for it, that no one had done this before, that no one had raised the visibility of how concentrated and centralized the supply of medicine is. These are products that are essential for life, and yet it wasn't talked about. It wasn't talked about in this country, and it wasn't talked about in countries around the world. So it really is the first endeavor and first book, China RX, to put this out there. But it still is surprising to me that we need to act quickly to begin to rectify the situation. And that's a silver lining of this global pandemic, and that is, will it spur us, will it motivate us to diversify our manufacturing capability and bring some of that manufacturing back to the United States and to other countries.
You mentioned blood pressure medication being important, and that actually reminded me of the opening story that you have in your book, in China RX, which is kind of a harrowing story of the realities and kind of paints a picture. I'm wondering if you could share that briefly for us in your own words.
Yeah, the opening in China RX is a story about a contamination of a drug that killed hundreds of Americans, and I understand that there are deaths in other countries about 12 years ago. This is a commonly used medicine in hospitals called heparin. It's also used for people when they're on kidney dialysis, and it was in short supply back then. And that's because there was a disease that ravaged the pig population in China, blue ear disease. And it turns out the core material to make it comes from pigs. And China has the largest pig population in the world because the Chinese people love pork. And so when there weren't enough pigs from which to derive this raw material, enterprising minds came up with a fake substitute. And it mimicked so closely the real product that when the time came to have it tested, this fake contaminant passed under the radar of the tests that were used at the time. And it turns out this fake contaminant was lethal in high quantities. And so how do you tell that story? So I found a family whose husband was a prominent physician, trained at a very prominent medical school here in the United States, had a thriving practice, and he went into the emergency room one night of a hospital, and he had a bleeding stomach ulcer, and they said, why don't you stay overnight instead of going back home? And for inexplicable reasons, he was given heparin, and it's unusual because if you have a bleeding ulcer, why was he given heparin? But so be it, and he got a couple large doses, and within 11 minutes of getting those doses, his heart began to fail and his other organs began to fail. And a week later, he had to have his heart removed because it was so damaged. He died 3 months later of a horrific death. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other Americans that face that situation, as well as people in other countries. So there's a real price that we're paying when we have these long supply chains, and it's not possible to assure the same quality standards that we have known for in the United States and Europe and other countries, and also for the people in China and other countries around the world. We should all expect high quality standards. But I'm increasingly concerned about the diminishment of those standards. What we're seeing right now is that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they've suspended inspections in China because of coronavirus. They don't want their employees, who are federal government employees, to travel to China because it's simply not safe. And what they do is they go in and they inspect these plants there where our drugs are made. There's a very specific process that has to be followed to assure that our medicines are made to the quality specifications that we expect. So the FDA won't be doing that. So who's checking on the quality of our medicines? This is amplified by recent independent testing that's been going on with our generic drugs. Independent groups that have tested generics have found that more than 10% of them don't pass muster. They don't meet the standards for the active ingredient, for how it dissolves in the body. And these are 90% of the medicines we take in the United States. And trust is eroding in the medicines that we take to treat chronic conditions and even to cure us from disease. It's very, very troubling. Most recently, there was a worldwide recall of a very common blood pressure medicine, actually a series of them, valsartan, losartan, and that was because they contained carcinogens. And in some cases, these carcinogens were absolutely at lethal levels. There was a plant in China where the amount of this particular carcinogen, which is used to make rocket fuel, was more than 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. And this went out to millions of people, and they were taking it every day. And what's really troubling is that the company knew it had a problem, but it kept sending product to the United States anyway. So we have to find a way to ensure not only high-quality supply, but also high-quality medicines. And this is what happens when we lose control over the supply of something as important as medicine. We lose control over quality. We see during coronavirus, we're losing control over price because in shortages, prices spike. And then we lose control really over our national sovereignty. If you think about it, when we lose control over medicines and somebody else is controlling that supply, whoever controls that supply controls the world. Think of the leverage that you have over another country. We have the medicines, and if you want them, then that's huge power that we confer on another entity. So we really have to rethink our global supply chains for practical reasons to ensure that there's an unfettered supply, but also for issues of our national health security.
You know, Rosemary, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the unrestricted warfare doctrine, which we know that I don't know if you're familiar with it, that the Chinese Communist Party is known to employ, basically to use all different kind of non-obviously military forms of engagement with another country to actually do warfare. You know, and I was imagining as you were describing, you know, the weaponization of medicine. If you're controlling 90% of the precursors and whatever percent of actual medicines, you know, potentially you could deliberately put certain types of you know, different compounds or something to affect people. That's one thing. But now, as you were speaking towards the end, you're saying just simply withholding is probably the most powerful weapon. That is kind of a mind-blowing concept, actually.
Yes, well, there are two ways to do it. One is in a slightly more obvious way, and that is to contaminate medicines or to put no medicine in them, actually less obvious way. And that's very hard to trace and is far more insidious. That was the case with the heparin blood thinner. You know, it takes a long time before you find out and trace back that people are dying because of a drug that was contaminated or a drug that didn't have the full component of medicine in it. Say if you're undergoing cancer treatment, and we do import active ingredients for cancer chemotherapies, how do you know if a patient who's getting a cancer treatment is not getting better? Was that oncology drug really what it was supposed to be? Was it made properly? Let alone was it effective at full potency? So that's one issue. And the other issue is simply withholding supply, which is a much more obvious shot across the bow, which is really would be a very aggressive and frankly an unwise action, because that would truly damage the reputation of a country worldwide. It will be viewed as a country that can't be trusted if they withhold medicines. So there are lots of ways that our medicines can be used to coerce certain behaviors and force governments to do things that they otherwise would not do.
Rosemary, as you're discussing this, I'm thinking back to what we were discussing originally, which was, Big Pharma's response to this idea. I mean, as we're speaking here, it just seems like such a no-brainer that we should have some production here in America, and frankly, every country should have some production of very critical medicines, at least within its borders, or from countries that are, have rule of law and are friendly and this sort of thing. That's what I'm imagining as you're speaking. But so given the ease with which these precursors or medicines can be used as leverage or for blackmail or something like that, why would Big Pharma be so interested in keeping these supply chains? It's not clear to me. What are your thoughts?
I think it'd be good first to understand who these special interests are and have them come forward and describe why they are opposed to Buy American for medicines for the Department of Defense, for our veterans. We're spending $6 billion a year on generic drugs that are made in China. Why don't we keep that money here so we can grow our own industry and have real-time quality control right, nearby? That would certainly be a very wise thing to do. But it really is hard to understand why any special interest would want to oppose having medicines made for our military, made right here for national health security. It really is quite puzzling. And especially in light of the threat that was made to withhold medicines. The special interests here in Washington are effectively telling the American people that we want you to be more dependent on this entity that's threatened to kill you. How do you justify that?
Well, I'm trying to figure that out. One of the things that jumps to mind again from your book is that the pharmaceutical companies seem to be very unwilling to explain where their products are made. That's something you documented extensively. What's that all about?
That's right. There's was country of origin labeling legislation that was proposed about 12 years ago here in the U.S. Congress, and it was killed immediately. And I asked someone in the industry who's worked for about 30 years, I said, so why was that legislation tabled and thrown out? And the response was that, well, businesses probably thought it wouldn't be good if their customers knew where their product was made. If you think about it, this was back around 2007 and 2008 when the heparin contamination took place. And China was still emerging and working on improving the quality of its products. Back then, the head of the Chinese FDA was executed for taking bribes. And it was also a time when there were thousands of dogs and cats here in this country died because of pet food that was contaminated with an industrial chemical called melamine. And then there was the infant formula. So it's not just Americans that saw this, but also people in China suffered under this. And what was so surprising to me while writing China RX is during that period, those events did not stop the industry from outsourcing product to a country that surely didn't have the same standards because it was still new in its growth and development. It's made a lot of progress since then. It was really quite remarkable that the industry allowed that to happen. And back then, the FDA was not inspecting plants, so we went from a first world standard to really an unregulated standard for the chemicals in our medicines, the active ingredients. And increasingly now, generic drugs. About 10% of the generic drugs in the United States now are made in China, and many of them are made by domestic companies. And these include things like medicines for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and epilepsy, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, birth control pills. It's really quite remarkable. And meanwhile, we're seeing our own domestic industry collapse. Western companies are just falling apart. These are the Western generic drug makers, and they're different from the innovator companies who we tend to call them Big Pharma. If we had the list of generic companies, most people would not know and have never heard of those names. But they are dropping like flies because they can't compete. Because we have Western companies, they're not competing with Chinese companies, they're competing with the Chinese government, which subsidizes their companies so they can achieve, as a country, the global aim to become the pharmacy to the world. So as a country, the United States, Europe, everywhere else, we have a strategic decision to make. Do we want to continue on the same path of being dependent on a single country with all the risks that that entails? Or do we want to have a capability for a diversified supply chain and bring some of that manufacturing back home?
I know this is very difficult to know, but we know that it's roughly 90% of the precursors that are coming from China, but do you have an estimate for the actual number of medicines which are being produced there?
That I don't know. We just don't have data on the volumes of medicines. And the information on the precursors, these chemicals, they're chemical molecules. That comes from people who make products, those who are in the plants, the chemists and the pharmaceutical engineers. If you ask them, they'll tell you where it's sourced from. And because they have it in their book, they have to go buy these products to make medicines here and elsewhere, so they know. But we don't have data on the volume and actually how much is produced.
You mentioned earlier there's been these pushes in the past to try to identify where the medicines are created. Is there anything like that going on now?
There isn't much happening on that score. There have been some bills that mention country of origin, but I think that's going to be a very challenging piece of legislation and provision to get enacted. I'd rather see us start moving more quickly with a plan to reshore production of those most critical products. We're talking about coronavirus now, which is a infection caused by a virus. What about bacterial infections? There's biowarfare, and if we don't have antibiotics to treat bacterial infections, we're in deep trouble. After the anthrax attacks in Washington and New York in 2001, the federal government had to buy about 20 million doses of an antibiotic to treat anthrax exposure. It's called doxycycline. It's used for a lot of other things like Lyme disease. And we didn't make it here, and we still don't make it here. And so the federal government had to go to a European company, and I interviewed the CEO of that firm, and he said he had to get the starting material from a plant in China. So when we're in the midst of something, of a pandemic and even worse, we won't have time to make anything. We won't have time to source it from other countries. And the consequences could be very, very devastating. So we have to fix it. We have to fix it now. And it's going to take the free market will not fix this. People will say, well, let the private sector do this, let the free market fix this. Well, what is the free market? There is no free market because companies, investors will want a return on their investment. But say you and I start a manufacturing plant and we want to sell product, but we're undercut by Chinese companies that are subsidized by their government. There's no way that we can win that. So the United States government and Congress has to understand this and decide whether or not we want to support the capability to make medicines here at home. It's going to take more than just incentives. Our infrastructure is demolished for generic drug manufacturing. There's a very large plant not far from Washington, D.C. that used to employ about 2,500 people, and it's slated for closure. They were making generic products. Are we as a country going to let that go? And this is happening right now in the midst of a pandemic. So we have some very important strategic decisions to make as a country. And we have to cut through the narrative that's out there that that special interests want to maintain the status quo. And meanwhile, if you ask people on the street, no matter where they are in the political spectrum, they understand the importance of having capability to make medicines. And people still remember when their dogs and cats died because of contaminated pet food. So there's a mistrust out there. And we're seeing mistrust of generic drugs now, even among physicians. I had the pleasure of doing grand rounds at a hospital, and I met a physician during that visit. And he showed me a cabinet in his office, and it had those amber-colored plastic bottles with the white caps on them that are hard to open. And I said, "Where'd you get those?" And he said, "Well, I asked patients to see if they would give them to me," because he didn't tell them this, but he had some concern about whether those medicines were actually working as they should. He saw that some patients didn't seem to get better. And these are people who are pretty sick people. And these medicines can make the difference between life or death. And he said, "I want to have those tested." So we're now in a situation where physicians are doubting the quality of the medicines that they're giving to patients. And once you lose that trust, it's very, very hard to regain it. I think I've been calling for public reporting of the quality of medicine, have test results put out there, a consumer reports type model, independent testing, and that will automatically turn the market around. But we still have to invest in U.S. and other Western companies' capability for manufacturing, again, because they will not be subsidized by their government. You know, we subsidize things like agriculture to make sure we have enough food. We subsidize roads and highways and bridges. We subsidize the military. We wouldn't have our aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines made in China. We realize that there are some things that are so sacred, that are essential to the functioning of a society, that we make them here. That's smart. And we need to start thinking of our medicines as a strategic asset and not outsource that thousands of miles away in a country that has threatened the United States to cut off supply. Imagine if China issued a threat to cut off food supply. Say if they controlled the supply of wheat or supply of corn to the United States. Imagine if they threatened to cut that off. There'd be immediate reaction in Congress not to allow that. And efforts to encourage farmers here to grow wheat. But here we have a situation with medicine. You know, without medicines, countries cease to function. So we have to begin to change the narrative and put the voice out there, the common sense norms of the public who understand that this is just not on. And so we'll keep doing that for the foreseeable future.
Rosemary, this really hits home. You know, many, many moons ago, I actually took doxycycline prophylactically as an anti-malarial. You know, you can imagine if I had to doubt that there's actually doxycycline in the pill. That's a kind of a harrowing thought. A second quick thought actually is you're saying that there's actually medicine manufacturing plants in the U.S. right now that have been functioning that are threatened with closure. Did I catch that right?
That's right, yes. And there are plants that have already closed that are littered. They have equipment in them. And so why don't we take advantage of that infrastructure? We don't have to rebuild all of it. They might have to be retooled and upgraded, but let's take advantage of that manufacturing capability, those plants, now. Well, what we need is buyers, like the Department of Defense and the VA. They have 20 million people that they have to take care of. Why don't we make those medicines here in those plants that have been abandoned or going to be shutting down? That would be good for communities, good for jobs, and good for our national security. And my goodness, even the Department of Defense, it's really quite remarkable that there are some companies that won't even tell the Department of Defense where they source their product from. That just is not on. One of the recommendations I gave when I testified to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission is that companies should be required to tell the Department of Defense where the drugs they sell to the DoD and the components to make them are sourced. That's just common sense. You know, if you think about it, recently the USS Theodore Roosevelt that was on patrol in the South China Sea,
right,
that 24 members of the crew were diagnosed with coronavirus, and so they went into port to have everybody tested. Just think of those young men and women that they're dependent on the adversary for the antidotes for coronavirus.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been speaking, I've been imagining that exact scenario because it's also sort of unprecedented for an aircraft carrier to even say what it's going to do next, right? I think typically that sort of information would be classified, but here it is going into port. There's all sorts of ramifications of this, the whole coronavirus and also, of course, the medicines as you're describing. You know, another thing that just jumped to my mind is, you know, so someone should be out there cataloging exactly what manufacturing capability that's, you know, at 70% ready or 80%. You mentioned they need to be retooled, but this would seem like a no-brainer. There's probably some capacity that can be very quickly you know, recreated in the country that exists. I hadn't even thought of that prior to speaking with you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's beginning to happen. I'm really delighted that the China RX book was the first to put this out there for policymakers in the executive branch and legislative branch and in the private sector. And the first recommendation in the book is to have the federal government know who controls the supply of our medicine. It was one of the most shocking findings in writing and researching it was that it's no one's job in the federal government to know who controls our drug supply. And that's changed now. And now federal agencies and others are looking to see where they are vulnerable, where we are vulnerable in terms of having sole source or fragile supply chains in China or any other individual country for that matter. And the next step then that is taking place is what capacity do we have now? You've seen this with respirators and masks and ventilators. Who can make these things? So that's underway, and we're beginning to see the similar thing underway with regard to our prescription drugs. But again, the challenge is, where do the core chemicals come from? For many of our medicines, they are sourced primarily in China. You saw that India withheld exports of critical drugs. And that's because India is the largest generic drug maker in the world. But it depends on China for about 70% of the core chemicals that sustains its industry. So if you don't have those chemicals, then you can't take care of your own population. And so why would you want to export medicines that you might need? The good news is in India, they have very few cases. They're on a 21-day lockdown, but they have very few cases of coronavirus. So there isn't a huge spike in demand for these critical drugs. But it goes to show, again, all roads lead to China. But the good news is we are beginning to look at the existing capability. The question is, will we take the next step when this coronavirus, the curve is flattened, and I hope we don't forget about this and we continue to work on it. How will we invigorate those plants? It's not just production. It's not just I'm going to pay you to make X product, but we're going to need some reinvestment in these manufacturing facilities. And even better, if we're going to make any investment, we have brilliant minds and tremendous ingenuity in this country. And there are people who can make our generic drugs faster, cheaper, with real-time quality control, and in a smaller environmental footprint. Right here, fully. They can make all of the components. And the price, people say, well, it will cost more to make in the United States. That's not true. Once the investment is made in new infrastructure, new equipment, we can actually make generic drugs at least 20% cheaper. But those manufacturers will need guaranteed contracts because if you put that product on the open market, China will come in and undercut it, and investors will have no incentive to invest. So we need long-term contracts with Department of Defense, Health and Human Services for the Strategic National Stockpile, for veterans. That's how we can start as a country to rebuild our industrial base that's currently collapsing. That would be a great boon for our economy, and plus it'll keep taxpayers' money here in this country. But we have to get policymakers to take that next step. It's good to see that there's a lot of awareness now about dependence on a single country, on China. But are we going to act? Will we turn those words and good intentions into actually making those investments that matter?
Rosemary, it's quite the claim to say that we could actually produce a lot of these things 20% cheaper
Absolutely.
in America. Can you kind of speak to how you came up with those numbers? It's very interesting.
Well, the technology that we're using now to manufacture medicines is 100 years old. We are making drugs now the way we did 100 years ago. There's been more innovation in the manufacture of potato chips than in the manufacture of our medicines. And that's because branded companies just don't have the incentive to invest. They've made a few drugs using advanced manufacturing technology. But on the generic side, the margins are so slim that generic companies that are barely hanging on, they're not going to make that investment, again, if China comes in and undercuts them. So this technology has been used in the chemical industry for 100 years, and pharmaceutical manufacturing is basically chemical manufacturing for human purpose, for human health. And we should be adopting it, moving forward on it quickly. This could be, a renaissance in advanced manufacturing in this sector. But the private sector is not going to do it. So we have a choice of either to give it up and just surrender, or we have a chance to actually invest it with some public-private partnerships and make it here in the U.S. We have a precedent for this. There was a time when, right before flu season, the U.S. government got word that about 50 million doses of flu vaccine were not going to be available. This was coming from a company in the UK. Something happened in the plant. And so Congress acted, and of course took a while for them to act, but they established a public-private partnership with industry to actually contract with industry to make flu vaccines. So there is precedent in the United States for the manufacture of medicinal products. And somehow there's a hesitancy to do this for our generic drugs. We've got to get over that because we're hitting a critical inflection point, and the coronavirus pandemic is certainly a giant wake-up call.
So we're seeing, considerable industrial mobilization, most of it voluntary, a little bit of it through this, War Powers Act being enacted. And so there seems to be no reason why it wouldn't, go in the direction of creating medicines.
It was very surprising to me that in the $8.3 billion coronavirus spending package, that there was money for manufacturing ventilators, respirators, masks, and gloves. But there wasn't any money for the manufacture of medicines that, even before coronavirus, were in shortage. Why is that? Medicines are life and death also. So how can we, and even in the big spending bill, the $2 trillion, there was no money for the manufacture of medicine. It's really quite remarkable. Somehow this space has been off limits to thinking about this in a public interest way rather than a private interest perspective. We've got to break through that. And the will of the people, the public understands this. I'm on social media, and people across the political spectrum understand that we really are on a wrong track here, and we've got to get back on track.
In your book, you actually did mention that there's 200 to 300 medicines that actually are actively in short supply well before coronavirus. And I'm just wondering, how does that happen exactly? I mean, some of them are critical medicines, right?
For the past 20 years, in the United States of America, we've had shortages of critical drugs. Some of these are antibiotics, medicines for surgery. And if you think about it, we have shortages of nothing in this country except vital medicines. Why is that? Because in a normal market, if there was a shortage of pizza because we couldn't get the tomatoes, well, entrepreneurs would go out there and contract with people, say, can you grow us some tomatoes on a large scale so we can make pizza? Of course we can fix it. But for some reason, there's been an extreme reluctance. There's something wrong in that shadowy system that has allowed these shortages to persist. There has been an innovation with a nonprofit group called Civica RX, which is comprised of 1,300 hospitals that are buying medicines differently because they've been so concerned about shortages. So they all chipped in money, and they're doing exactly what someone making pizza who couldn't get tomatoes would do. They're going out to find reputable companies in trustworthy countries to make medicines. And they're buying as much as the active ingredient they can that's not made in China. And their secret sauce is to give manufacturers long-term contracts, pay them a fair price, not a race to the bottom price, and have full transparency on country of origin, who's making them, and they test them and they give them the certificate. This is to certify who is it that, whether this medicine is what it's supposed to be. This is about restoring market forces to the making of essential products. Within the first year of operation, to show that this is indeed fixable, they delivered their first very important antibiotic. We're talking about last resort antibiotics here, the things that are needed to sustain life in really sick people. We're talking about medicines to treat sepsis, which is a systemic infection that kills tens of thousands of people in this country and more around the world. So in the first year, they started making about 20 drugs, and then another 20 coming up, and they eventually want to have their own manufacturing plant here in the United States. That's how we have to think differently, use our purchasing dollars to buy a quality product. And the private sector is leading that. But we have to get our government and our taxpayer dollars directed in the same way to buy differently, to buy a quality product here at home.
Well, we're hearing all sorts of reports from around the country of, innovators, small manufacturers stepping up to kind of retool. We've heard recently, about pillow manufacturer,
Right.
Basically retooling to create masks. We hear all sorts of sort of remarkable stories of this happening. It seems like we do have, this is the first I've heard of this model. This sounds like a great model to study and emulate.
That's right. It's certainly replicable. And, we have the companies showing up to make respirators and masks because the federal government put money out for it. And people will come and they will make things. And for some reason, the federal government has not put money out to make vital medicines. That's what we need to turn around. And I think let's have a public debate on this. Let's have those who oppose making medicines in the United States for our military come out publicly and say it. And tell us the rationale and do it on national television. And tell the American people why that's beneficial. Why should our taxpayer dollars for our soldiers and Navy crew, why should we do that? Instead of hiding behind, the shadows of special interest lobbying. Let's have a public debate about it. Maybe Epoch Times could support that.
Looking at this draft letter that was written to basically, opposed by American on the pharma side. The argument, curiously, is precisely that it will disrupt the supply chains and the ability to create the medicines, at least one of them. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, there was a draft letter that someone sent me to the White House from special interests that were opposing Buy American for medicines for our military and the VA. And the notion was, well, this will disrupt our medicine supply chain. Well, our medicine supply chain is already in a shambles because of poor quality and persistent shortages. So there's a lot of improvement that needs to be made. But what was really striking is and that was on March 24th when that letter was shared with me. And then 2 days later, the Chinese leader came out on a G2 conference call, the virtual G20 meeting, I should say, and said a very similar talking point, that there shouldn't be, we don't want to do anything to we want to make sure we have a stable medicine supply chain. So both the talking points of the special interests in Washington seem to be so aligned with the talking points of the head of China speaking to the world. How did that happen? And it's remarkable also that special interests in Washington oppose or don't oppose China's approach to actually increasing production of core ingredients and medicines for the world. You know, if the United States does that, that's considered nationalism. But if China does it, it's okay. And of course, there is no concern among special interests that that will persist the monopoly and grow the monopoly that China has on the global supply. This is putting the world at risk, without doubt.
You know, looking at the way that the Chinese Communist Party has handled the coronavirus outbreak and pandemic, how does that speak to this, in your mind, to what we would expect in terms of medicine production and so forth? Is there a connection, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's all about trust, isn't it? Trust is essential for the world to function. And the question is, in a lot of people's minds, can we trust? I hope your people watching this will, do you trust? If you trust, great, but if you don't trust, how do we act and move forward? You know, it's not the first time China has threatened us with drug shortages. They've threatened the United States with drug shortages before. But this threat was out there, very visible. The other threat was a very quiet threat. And I learned about it when I was writing China RX. I mean, this is a threat to kill Americans by withholding medicines. And you can't get more brazen than that. And if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is.
Rosemary, that's a powerful place to finish up. But before we do, any final thoughts?
Well, I just think we have an opportunity together to do so much good for the world. You know, the coronavirus has caused a lot of angst and fear, and how can we work together to come out of it? And for the next thing that happens, and something will happen, there'll be a next coronavirus or something like it, and we can be so much better prepared. We don't have to go through this angst and concern about, are there masks? Are we going to protect our healthcare workers? Can we really take care of people who are sick? You know, these events are like hurricanes in that they're predictable. We plan for hurricanes. We prepare for them. But we don't do that for situations like this. And if nothing else, we're in a moment in time where we have a chance to learn from this and take those lessons and prepare so much better. So we have what we need when we need it for every person, because it will hit the fan someday. There will be other events that come, but we can be ready for it.
Rosemary Gibson, such a pleasure to have you on.